Imagine a billionaire with everything: wealth, power, luxury, but despite all his wealth no woman wanted him. After 5 successful divorces and countless broken hearts, his reputation was destroyed. Why? Because behind the wealth was a man who had no time and respect for women. After being confronted with the truth, everything changed. But will he find love again? Stay tuned, for you won't believe what happens next. Calvin Hargrove was living the dream that everyone fantasized about but few ever achieved. Born to a humble family in the bustling streets of New York, Calvin's rise to the top was nothing short of a miracle. He wasn't born into wealth. Oh no, Calvin worked his way through life, crawling up from the bottom with nothing but his smarts and determination. By the time he was 35, he had amassed a fortune most people couldn't even count without getting lost in zeros. With his chiseled jawline, perfectly tailored suits, and charisma that could sell water to a fish, Calvin seemed to have it all. Women admired him, men wanted to be him, and everyone else just stood in awe of his accomplishments. He owned multiple tech companies, had houses scattered across different continents, and more luxury cars than any garage could handle. If you threw a rock in any direction, you'd probably hit one of his properties. But despite all his success, there was one thing Calvin could never seem to grasp: happiness. Sure, he could buy any material thing his heart desired, but there was a void that no amount of money could fill. It gnawed at him, quietly at first, but louder with each passing day. Most nights, as he sat alone in his penthouse, staring out over the glittering skyline, Calvin found himself asking the same question: what is all this for? Yet, instead of looking within, Calvin did what he thought was best: he distracted himself. And what better distraction than women? To Calvin, relationships were like business deals, straightforward and transactional. He didn't need love, he needed status, and that's exactly what these high-profile marriages gave him. One after the other, Calvin walked down the aisle with women who seemed perfect on paper: Jasmine, the brilliant fashion designer; Erica, the sharp attorney; Monique, the international model; Alicia, the award-winning chef; and Tiffany, the fierce journalist. Each one of these women seemed like they would complete him, but in Calvin's world, no one was ever enough. He treated these women as extensions of his empire, not as equals or partners. To Calvin, they were accessories: a shiny watch, a sleek car, something to parade around for the cameras. It wasn't long before each relationship crumbled under the weight of Calvin's ego. He was married 5 times, and 5 times he managed to mess it up. His record was becoming the stuff of tabloid legends. But, of course, in Calvin's mind, the problem wasn't him. It was always them. They just didn't appreciate him enough. But, as his marriages dissolved faster than anyone could say prenup, the world started to see Calvin for what he truly was: a man who could buy anything but love. Calvin's love life became the ultimate Hollywood disaster flick, full of drama, expensive settings, and tragic endings. From the outside looking in, Calvin's life was a fairy tale, but behind the closed doors of his glittering mansions, it was a circus, and he was the ringmaster. Each marriage started the same way. Calvin would sweep the lucky woman off her feet with grand gestures: a private jet to Paris for dinner, a yacht party off the coast of Italy, or diamond necklaces that could blind you in broad daylight. It was a whirlwind of romance and luxury, and for a while, everything seemed perfect. He made sure the media was watching, too. Every extravagant vacation or red carpet appearance was a headline in the making: billionaire Calvin Hargrove finds his perfect match again. But the honeymoon phase never lasted. Soon, Calvin's true colors would start to show. He was never around. Business came first, second, and third, and his wives were nothing more than 4th place. He couldn't be bothered with conversations or emotional support. If Jasmine had a bad day at work, Calvin would respond with, "Buy yourself something nice. That'll fix it." If Alicia needed his attention, he'd say, "I'm building an empire, not a daycare." And then there was the anger. Oh, the anger. Calvin had a short fuse, especially when things didn't go his way. If Erica dared to question his decisions, Calvin would explode, hurling insults like a toddler throwing toys. And Monique, well, let's just say Calvin once threw a vase through the window during an argument, something he laughed off the next day like it was no big deal. But for the woman who lived with him, it was like being in a pressure cooker. One by one, they walked out. Jasmine left first, followed by Erica, Monique, Alicia, and finally Tiffany. Calvin's divorce record became as famous as his business success. The tabloids had a field day. Headlines screamed, "Calvin Hargrove can't keep a wife, what's the real problem?" But instead of learning from his mistakes, Calvin convinced himself that it wasn't his fault. No, these women just didn't understand him. They couldn't keep up with his lifestyle, his drive, his success. They were the problem, not him. Or at least, that's what he told himself as he sat alone in his penthouse, scrolling through old wedding photos like a museum tour of failed relationships. Yet, deep down, a small voice whispered something Calvin wasn't ready to admit. Maybe it's you, buddy. Maybe it's always been you. Calvin couldn't keep living in denial forever. After his fifth marriage imploded with Tiffany walking out the door, leaving behind nothing but a signed divorce paper and a handwritten note saying, "You can't love anyone until you learn to respect them," something began to shift in him. The glitz and glamour of his life began to lose their luster. Every night, instead of attending another high society gala or rubbing elbows with celebrities, Calvin found himself sitting in his multi-million-dollar penthouse alone. Sure, he could call up any number of women and have them swoon over his money, but the thrill of it was gone. Empty conversations, meaningless flirtations, it all started to feel like background noise in a life that was becoming hollow. One night, while scrolling through social media, Calvin stumbled upon a photo of Erica, his second ex-wife, now remarried with kids. They looked happy, genuinely happy. Something about their smiles, the warmth in their eyes, struck a chord Calvin had buried deep. His mind flashed back to the times when he had it all, beautiful, intelligent women who once loved him. How had he let it all slip away? It was then that Calvin finally did something out of character. He called a marriage counselor. And not just any counselor, but Dr. Olivia Brooks, a renowned relationship expert known for her no-nonsense approach. She was the one celebrities went to when their marriages were teetering on the edge of disaster, and now, Calvin needed her more than ever. His ego protested at the thought of admitting he needed help, but he was desperate, even if he wouldn't admit it out loud. During their first session, Dr. Brooks didn't sugarcoat things. She sat across from him, eyes sharp, cutting through his defenses like a hot knife through butter. "Calvin," she said, "tell me about your marriages." Calvin, trying to maintain his usual confidence, began recounting his relationships. He spoke about the women, their flaws, how they didn't appreciate him, how they never understood his life. Dr. Brooks listened quietly, jotting down notes, her face unreadable. After a long pause, she simply asked, "And what about you?" Calvin was taken aback. "What about me?" Dr. Brooks leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "You've told me what went wrong with them. Now, let's talk about you. What did you do?" For the first time in his life, Calvin had no quick answer. He sat in silence, the realization slowly dawning on him, maybe the problem was him all along. It was during one of these counseling sessions that Calvin finally broke down. After weeks of peeling back the layers of his relationships, Dr. Brooks had managed to break through his emotional walls. Sitting in the pristine, white office, Calvin fidgeted with his Rolex, avoiding eye contact. I never respected them," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought money and gifts were enough. I treated them like accessories. Dr. Brooks nodded but said nothing, giving Calvin the space to keep talking. I was always so busy building my empire. I never gave them time, attention, love. I treated them like employees, expecting them to just do what I wanted. As the words poured out, Calvin felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, shame. His eyes welled up with tears, but he wiped them away quickly, embarrassed to show weakness in front of someone else. I had them, he continued, his voice cracking. I pushed them all away because I was too blind to see what I was doing. He paused, looking down at his hands. I never deserved any of them. Dr. Brooks finally spoke, her tone gentle. Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step, Calvin. But it's not enough just to feel guilty. You have to do something about it. Calvin nodded, though a part of him still wasn't sure if he could. Could a man like him really change? Could he, after years of mistreating women, become the person he wished he had been all along? That night, Calvin stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. For the first time in his life, the billionaire didn't like what he saw. The money, the success, it all felt empty. He knew, deep down, if he didn't change, he'd spend the rest of his life alone. After that breakthrough with Dr. Brooks, Calvin decided it was time to take real action. He had spent his whole life building an empire, but now he needed to rebuild himself. It wasn't going to be easy, and it definitely wasn't going to be quick. But for the first time in his life, Calvin was ready to do the hard work. Dr. Brooks gave him homework, yes, homework. Calvin laughed at the idea initially. Homework? For a billionaire. But this wasn't business school, and the work she gave him had nothing to do with money. It was all about relationships. Calvin had to attend relationship seminars, read books on emotional intelligence, and even join community support groups where people shared their stories of love and heartbreak. At first, Calvin felt out of place. He was surrounded by regular people with regular problems. One group member talked about losing his job, another shared how she struggled with low self-esteem after a breakup. Calvin, with his millions and his penthouse, felt like he didn't belong. What did he know about struggle? But as the weeks passed, Calvin started to realize something profound. Everyone in that room, whether rich or poor, was dealing with the same basic human need, connection. The group didn't care about his money or his fancy titles. They cared about the person underneath. And slowly, Calvin began to open up. He shared stories about his failed marriages, his mistakes, and how he had always put himself first. It was during one of these sessions that Calvin met her, Tonya, a single mother with 2 kids. She wasn't flashy or high-profile like the woman Calvin used to date. She was kind, humble, and grounded in a way that Calvin found refreshing. They started talking after one of the meetings, and before long, Calvin found himself looking forward to seeing her every week. But this time, Calvin knew he had to take things slow. No grand gestures, no sweeping her off her feet with luxury trips. Instead, he started small. They went on walks, grabbed coffee, and talked, really talked. For the first time, Calvin was learning how to be present for someone. If you are enjoying the story, kindly hit on the like button, subscribe, and comments where you are watching from. Let's continue. Tonya wasn't like any of the women Calvin had been with before. She had 2 kids from a previous relationship, worked as a teacher, and lived a modest life in the suburbs. Calvin could have easily swooped in with his wealth and made everything easier for her, but that wasn't what Tonya wanted. She wanted respect. She wanted someone who listened. Someone who cared about her and her children. And to Calvin's surprise, she didn't care one bit about his wealth. In fact, when Calvin tried to impress her by offering to buy her a new car, Tonya laughed and said, "I don't need a car, Calvin. I need a man who's going to show up, really show up." That comment hit him hard. It was a reality check. Tonya didn't want his money, she wanted him to be there for her emotionally. So, Calvin did something he never thought he'd do. He rolled up his sleeves and got involved in Tonya's life. He helped her with the kids' schoolwork, attended their soccer games, and even spent weekends volunteering at their community center. He wasn't just helping Tonya, he was helping others in the community as well. It was strange at first, but as time went on, Calvin found himself enjoying it. In those moments, surrounded by people who saw him not as the billionaire but simply as Calvin, he realized something. He was finally learning what it meant to truly care about others. It wasn't about grand gestures or throwing money around. It was about showing up, being there, and offering support in ways that actually mattered. And slowly, Tonya began to trust him. She saw the effort he was making and how he was becoming a better man, not just for her, but for himself. But there was still one question looming: could Calvin be the man Tonya needed him to be? Or would he fall back into his old ways? As Calvin continued to build his relationship with Tonya, the whispers from his past began to surface. His reputation, once untouchable in the world of business, was now a point of gossip among social circles. Rumors about his past treatment of women had spread far and wide, and despite his transformation, people still held on to the image of the old Calvin, the arrogant billionaire who broke hearts without a second thought. Tonya, too, had heard the whispers. It was impossible not to. Everywhere they went, people looked at Calvin with a mix of curiosity and judgment. At first, she chose to ignore it, focusing on the man Calvin was becoming rather than who he used to be. But as the rumors grew louder, she couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, she confronted him. "I know about your past," Tonya said, her voice calm but serious. "And I need to know, why should I believe you've changed?" Calvin felt his heart sink. He had known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. He sat down across from her, taking a deep breath. "I can change what I did before," he said quietly, "and I'm not proud of it. I disrespected women. I used them, discarded them, and never thought twice about it. But that's not who I want to be anymore." Tonya looked at him, her gaze steady. "But how do I know that? How do I know you won't hurt me the same way you hurt them?" Calvin sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't expect you to believe me right away. But I'm not asking you to trust my words, I'm asking you to watch my actions. I'm trying, Tonya. I really am. And I'll keep trying, for as long as it takes, to prove to you that I've changed." For a long moment, Tonya said nothing. She just looked at him, searching his eyes for any sign of deceit. But all she found was sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "But I need you to understand, if you hurt me or my kids, we're done. No second chances." Calvin nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I won't," he promised. Determined to prove not just to Tonya but to himself that he was a changed man, Calvin dove headfirst into giving back to the community. He donated large sums of money, yes, but more importantly, he gave his time. Calvin volunteered at local shelters, mentored troubled teens, and attended every single community event, making sure to show up where it really counted. At first, people were skeptical. The community had heard the rumors too, and many of them didn't trust that Calvin's sudden philanthropy was genuine. They thought it was just another rich man's PR stunt to clean up his image. But Calvin didn't give up. He kept showing up, week after week, without fanfare or media coverage. He built relationships with the people around him, real relationships. One day, after volunteering at a soup kitchen, an older woman named Miss Lorraine, who had been eyeing him suspiciously for weeks, finally approached him. "I know who you are," she said, her voice sharp. "I've heard the stories. But you've been here, every week, working like the rest of us. So tell me, why should I believe you've changed?" Calvin looked her in the eye, no longer afraid to face his past. "Because I'm not the man I used to be," he said, simply. "I've made mistakes, terrible ones. But I'm here now, trying to be better. And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to do the right thing." Miss Lorraine studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Keep at it," she said. "Time will tell if you mean it." From that day forward, Calvin's efforts were no longer met with suspicion. Slowly but surely, the community began to accept him. And as Calvin's actions spoke louder than any apology, his transformation became a beacon of hope, not just for Tonya, but for everyone who had ever doubted him. Months passed, and Calvin's life had truly transformed. He was no longer the cold, detached billionaire people once knew. Instead, he had become a fixture in the community, known not for his wealth, but for his generosity and genuine efforts to make the world around him better. But there was still one thing he hadn't fully conquered, his fear of commitment, of trusting himself to be a good partner. Tonya had been patient. She'd watched Calvin change before her eyes, and although she admired his growth, she hadn't let her guard down completely. One evening, after spending time together at a neighborhood event, Calvin found himself alone with Tonya in her modest living room. The kids were asleep, and the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock. Calvin felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. He had always been a man of action, of grand gestures, but this wasn't about money or status. This was about his heart. "Tonya," he began, his voice hesitant but sincere. "I've spent so much of my life getting things wrong, especially when it comes to love. But with you, I finally feel like I'm getting it right." Tonya looked at him, her expression calm but curious. "Calvin, you've made a lot of progress. But what are you really trying to say?" He swallowed hard, his palms sweating. For a man who once made billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, asking Tonya to marry him felt like the biggest risk he'd ever taken. "I want us to be a family," he said softly. "I want to be there for you, for your kids. I want to spend the rest of my life making up for the mistakes of my past." Tonya's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Calvin nodded, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. He had no idea how she'd react, but he knew one thing: this wasn't about winning someone over with diamonds. It was about proving, once and for all, that he had truly changed. "Will you marry me, Tonya?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a gentle smile, Tonya reached out and took his hand. "Calvin, I never needed you to prove anything. You've already done that. But yes, I'll marry you." The two embraced, not as a billionaire and a teacher, but as two people who had finally found what they had been searching for: each other. Calvin's proposal wasn't just a moment of personal victory, it was a symbol of how far he had come. The man who had once disrespected women and failed at every relationship was now someone others looked up to. His engagement to Tonya sent waves through his community, but not for the reasons it would have in his past life. This time, the talk wasn't about his wealth, but about the kind of man he had become. Calvin's redemption story soon spread beyond his small community. Articles were written about him, not because of his business success, but because of his transformation as a human being. He was invited to speak at relationship seminars, sharing his story of failure and recovery. His message was clear: no matter how far you've fallen, it's never too late to change. But perhaps the most significant part of Calvin's journey was the way it impacted the people closest to him. Tonya's children, who had been wary of Calvin at first, now saw him as a father figure. Calvin was there for every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference, and every bedtime story. He had learned that the most valuable things in life weren't material, they were the moments of love and connection that couldn't be bought. On their wedding day, Calvin didn't rent out an island or hire a celebrity performer. Instead, he and Tonya held a simple ceremony at the community center where they had met. It was a small gathering, but it was filled with people who had witnessed Calvin's growth firsthand. Dr. Brooks was there, as were the members of the relationship group that had helped him along the way. As Calvin looked out at the faces of those who had supported him, he felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in his life, he wasn't driven by the need to prove anything to anyone. He had found love, family, and most importantly, himself. The story of Calvin's transformation became a testament to the power of change, a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been lost. His legacy was no longer tied to his billions, but to the example he set for others, that it's never too late to become the person you're meant to be. And in the end, Calvin didn't just gain a wife, he gained a life worth living. Here are some moral lessons we can learn from the story. Wealth cannot buy happiness or respect. Despite Calvin's immense wealth and success, his lack of respect for women and emotional disconnect left him unfulfilled and isolated. The story shows that material riches can never replace the value of meaningful relationships and mutual respect. Self-reflection is key to growth. Calvin's journey toward change begins with his decision to seek counseling and engage in self-reflection. This teaches that personal growth requires acknowledging one's mistakes, understanding their root causes, and being willing to make necessary changes. Actions speak louder than words. While Calvin spoke of his desire to change, it was only when he demonstrated his transformation through his actions that others began to believe in him. The lesson here is that true change is proven by consistent behavior, not just promises. Redemption is possible with commitment. Calvin's eventual redemption shows that no matter how much harm someone has caused, it's never too late to turn things around. Through genuine effort and commitment, he was able to change his life and find happiness. Trust must be earned. Calvin had to work hard to earn Tonya's trust, as she was rightfully wary of his reputation. This teaches that trust, once broken, takes time and effort to rebuild, and people must prove themselves through their actions. Relationships require respect and care. One of the key reasons Calvin's previous marriages failed was his failure to show respect and appreciation for his partners. The story emphasizes that love and respect are the foundation of successful relationships, and without them, even the strongest bonds can break. Growth comes through giving back. Calvin's transformation was amplified when he began giving back to his community and helping others. The lesson here is that true fulfillment comes not from wealth or success, but from contributing to the well-being of others and being part of something greater. Never let your past define your future. Though Calvin had made significant mistakes in his past, he didn't allow them to define his future. He learned from his failures, grew from them, and eventually created a new life built on positive values. This demonstrates that it's never too late to start over and make a positive change. Love is about partnership, not possession. In Calvin's relationship with Tonya, he learned that love is not about control or possession, but about partnership, mutual support, and respect. Healthy relationships thrive when both partners value each other and work together as equals. Redemption inspires others. Calvin's transformation didn't just affect his own life, it became a source of inspiration for others. The story shows that when one person makes the effort to change for the better, it can inspire those around them to reflect on their own lives and strive for growth.